At this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Charles Payne, who will join us as a respondent, followed by Dr. Stevens Reich. Dr. Payne?
Thank you. I want to thank Professor Raver for what I thought was a really, really important talk. One word of warning before I actually begin. I'm from New Jersey. People from New Jersey speak a lot faster than people from New York. And you would be well advised not to bother me about that. It's fascinating to me to have watched, having studied urban school change for 40 years, and this is important, only becoming interested in the early years, in the last 2 or 3 years, because that's the way we were trained when I was trained to think about urban school systems, right? What happened in the early grades was not a part of our imaginary, as we say, right? But to watch the national change in this conversation in the last 2 years, I have seldom seen an idea kick in with this much force. When I say an idea, I mean the idea of pre-K through 3rd grade, right? I've seldom seen an idea kick in so rapidly, right? And I'm delighted that it's happening. In Woodlawn, and I was walking in, and I was glad to see that 2 members of the Woodlawn Children's Promise Community Early Childhood Committee are in the first row where they should be. We are working with Arthur Reynolds from the University of Minnesota to revive one of the best ideas that Chicago had and daggone near destroyed, which is the idea of the Child Parent Center, but now an intensified version using the Child Parent Center ideas around a pre-K through 3rd grade model. And I believe our plan is to have something off for some number of children in September. That was the last I was heard. But so I am just delighted to hear that this conversation is getting more prominence in Chicago as it is in the rest of the country. But I've also, I have a very strong feeling that good ideas are not necessarily good, in a sense, in urban school systems. What I mean is that the mere fact that we can demonstrate in some measure that a certain idea is good does not mean that that idea will be proof against the various pathologies of urban school systems, right? We have had in Chicago a long, long list of good ideas which failed because they were inadequately implemented, right? So it is not simply a matter of what it is we need to be doing. This is what we should be doing, right? It's a matter of how, given our particular history of, I would have to say, mediocre implementation in the city of Chicago as against the leading, what I think of as the leading urban districts. How do we implement this better, right? Let me give you a few things to start worrying about now, well in advance. If it happens, it's going to happen these are not inexpensive reforms at the front end, right? I think we all know how much money they save down the road, but our political leaders tend to not think down the road, right? It's always the front end argument with them. There will be many pressures to spread the programming as widely as possible, right? That's the death knell, right? To try to put a little bit of something in every neighborhood. And I'm morally conflicted every time I have to say this, right? But there are times when you have to concentrate resources. And I come down and we have to take whatever resources are available and concentrate them enough so that we have a high probability of getting strong results. Because right now the idea is to build long-term support for this kind of investment in children and families and communities. And we cannot do that unless our initial efforts put up some really strong numbers. And I'll come back to the numbers effort later. So I just think, and by the way, here's a prediction for you, right? When and if it ever happens in Chicago, there's going to be a struggle over the class size issue. If memory serves, by contract, a kindergarten classroom in Chicago can be as many as 28 children. Now they're going to try, I'll bet you, somebody's going to try to do this with 28 children in a classroom, right? But that's that issue about we don't have the resources, so we spread it as widely as possible. That's not what we're talking about here, I'm sure. But this notion of spreading the resources too thin, that's one issue that we have to think about. Mr. Reich is closer to this than I am, but I always, right now in particular, I am worried about the principal core in Chicago. A number of reasons. It's turning over very rapidly. The last I heard, I think we're losing 160 principals in the next year or so. That's one issue. But I have never had the sense that the principals in Chicago had they really see themselves as principals in elementary schools, as principals of the 3rd grade and up, right? I don't think they have had a great deal, many of them have had a lot of training in the primary years, and they tend to let those teachers go off in the wing of the building. The kids don't cause as much trouble as the older kids. Y'all, you guys do what you want to do. You don't have a whole lot of interaction with the teachers or the instructional research team. So I think there are some issues about capacity. I don't know how much our principals just know about instruction in this pre-K through 3rd grade period. And that's one. Now here's what I do know. We have been telling principals for 25, almost 30 years, that their job is to get those scores up. And when do we start testing? 3rd grade, right? So principals have been socialized to think, right, that the main point of their focus is going to be 3rd grade. So both in terms of principal capacity and principal focus, I think there will be need, as we move toward this kind of model, to think how principals are going to be supported in that process, right? And on top of this, Common Core is coming. And while I know leadership is going to say, listen, it's all really one thing conceptually, it's not going to feel like that to principals, right? It's going to feel like 2 revolutionary ideas coming down the pike simultaneously and being dumped on their desk with not enough support or instruction, right? There's a real need to think very hard about how we support principals as they go through this process. And for teachers, I mean, all I will say is same, right? One of the this whole notion of how curricular coherence across this 5-year period, that creates certain problems for teachers who are used to a certain degree of autonomy. By and large, so far as I can see, kindergarten teachers don't talk to preschool teachers. They don't adjust what they teach on the basis of what the 1st grade teacher is doing. And now we're asking them to lose a certain amount of autonomy. A great many teachers we're going to be asked them and we've had a little bit of this already in certain neighborhoods, asking them to move to new materials. Well, they like the materials they're using already. They've already been trained on those. They know those materials cold. They don't necessarily want to jump at something else. And then again, with teachers as with principals, there's always the problem of just reform exhaustion. Just too much has come down the pike. And there's another thing coming down the pike, right? And so we can talk till we're blue in the face. This is a qualitatively different kind of intervention. It's going to look the same for a while until teachers get some sense in it. I don't know exactly how to frame this, but if there's a thing with which I think we might disagree, and I understand why you did it, but the idea that you justify, if I followed correctly, social-emotional learning because of its academic effects, as a person who has to deal in the real world, I understand why you do that, right? Because in the real world, that's what's selling. I was at a meeting at MDRC, one of the nation's top research, and they were reviewing the research on the long-term impacts of preschool and less contact with the courts, less early sexual behavior, more likely to be employed, more likely to graduate high school, more likely to start college, and they're better parents when they become parents. And so we were reviewing all of this research, and people were sitting there saying, yeah, but what about test scores? It was like, if it's not changing test scores, you can change everything else, and this is some serious researchers. We have had very little discussion in this city about what should have been the shocking news that the Consortium on Urban School research announced in the fall. Black kids are farther behind today than they were 20 years ago. Right? Now, I've heard very little systematic discussion about that. Let me give you a hypothesis about that. Right? That's the price we pay in this city for reducing reform to academics, right? Because I do not think that the particular developmental challenges of black children are fundamentally academic. They're fundamentally social. And as we take resources out of the social and put them into the academics, I would expect that the children at the margin socially are the children who are going to get hurt the most by that, right? That's an hypothesis, right? But it's one that we need to think about. The children who are at the social margins are the children who most need explicit development of the skills and the attentions, the skills and the attitudes that are required to make connections to others, right? And so at this point, I want to fight at the level that they are both important, right? Yes, I absolutely believe that the overwhelming weight of the research, it says that if you develop social emotional, you'll get positive outcomes on both. I buy that, right? But I guess almost as a philosophical point now, right? It's that they are equally important in giving children control over their lives as adults, right? And it's just not clear to me that we can actually make such a strong case that the academics within the range we can manipulate academics are more important than the social within the range we can manipulate the social. I have yet to see the data for that case, right? As far as I'm concerned, for right now, they are both important, and they are most important. That is, the social is most important, I believe, for children of color. This is the kind of thing that get me run out of this room here. But just in terms of the notion of establishing a base for this, it is important that we have strong metrics, right? And I know that in parts of the early years community, there are all kinds of ferocious fights, right? Barbara Bowman, doggone that, beat me down the street one day for saying something like this about, premature quantification, right? You don't need to be putting numbers on these kids. I'm not prepared to debate the merits of it the way that Barbara could or many of you can, right? But all I am saying is that strictly from a political viewpoint, right, you have got to be able to say you move some numbers, right, in order to keep up the kind of support that it's going to need to justify these. I mean, you've got to be able to say you move some numbers. That's one thing, but in terms of implementation, you also need quality numbers, right? We don't need the ISAT again. We don't need numbers that don't predict anything, right? But we need quality numbers to let us know on a day-to-day basis. I mean, we still do not appreciate sufficiently the degree to which the on-track indicator in our high schools has changed high school practice. That 10% increase in our graduation rate is fairly impressive. It's good. It's not other cities have done better, but it's good, right? And it is driven more, I think, by any other single factor. The fact that we had a good metric and we started asking principals, no, why isn't this thing moving, right? What do you need to move it? What do you need to move it for this subgroup of students? What do you need to move it for that group of students? That conversation is possible if the metric isn't there. And let me predict this too. When parents and community organizations understand how few children are getting to school ready, that's the lid's gonna go off the pot when they understand how few of our children are school ready at 5. That's gonna be a really different kind of conversation. The other thing that I will say is we have to watch the attendance issues very carefully. By and large, the last I knew, the younger the kids, the worse the attendance in the city. The worst attendance in the city, the last time I saw any data, were among preschool children. Now, some of that has to do with the half-day thing, but that's not all of it, right? Some really complicated things are going on. And the last thing we need to do is to implement something that costs this much and we cannot get kids there, right? But we need to think the city as a whole needs to rethink its entire policy on attendance. I don't think it's had consistent attendance policy since the days of Paul Vallis. But in the early years, we need to be especially. I guess this is the last thing I will say. If I understand the issue of can we teach teachers, can we ask teachers to teach more, at least I come down for yep. And I know it's hard. I know it's a lot of things out there aren't their fault. And I know they're under-resourced classrooms and under-supported. I don't care. The truth is we have to ask our teachers, understanding that they're in under-resourced context, to do better, right? And so what I can see from the schools in the city, from the districts around the country that have done better, they are asking teachers, in Montgomery County, Baltimore, they're asking teachers to teach at a much higher level. And no, they don't have all the resources that they would have if they were in a suburb, but it is happening in some places. If you look at the number of fourth grade children who are reading at either the advanced or proficient level, we now have a group of districts which include New York, Miami, Charlotte, North Carolina, which are just about the national average, right? Those big cities do as well as the rest of the nation in terms of how well their young kids read, right? But it's around 30% are either advanced or proficient. All of those cities are either just above or just under 30%, which 31% is the national average, right, for 2011. At the other end, you got Detroit and Cleveland, right, where it's 4% of the kids in Detroit are in that category, 9% of the kids in Cleveland. In the middle, you have Chicago, which was 18%, which is 2% better than we were in 2009, by George. But you see what I'm saying? That's a huge variation in how well young children are doing from school to school. And so far as we can see, part of what's driving that is the culture around instruction in those cities and how seriously it's being taken. We do have to ask more of our teachers, and that means we have to give them more support. So anyway, one happy thought. I have no data for this either, but I'm as positive as I can be, just as a person who spends a lot of time in school, that the most optimistic teachers in a school tend to be the teachers of the youngest children, right? They tend to have a whole different attitude, and there still may be some issues there. But that's actually a strategic reason for investing in them, because one of the things that undermines so many of our school reform is that teachers don't believe in themselves. This is the fundamental issue, right? And their own agency, much less do they believe in the capacity of kids to do dramatically better, right? So it doesn't matter what you're doing. Most of our school reforms run up against that hard rock. I think there's less of that in the early years. That's a strategic. So with that, all I'll say is I think, and in this audience, I think most of you know that how a child scores academically in the 3rd grade predicts very well how the child will score in 11th and 12th grade, right? If we can do well, we can control for the child and the parent and the teacher that 5-year span from age 3 through grade 3, we have every reason to believe that it can have long-term consequences. So I think this really is the what, right? I don't have a lot of questions about the value of this. And now we need to think, if we're going to get the best results from it, let us think now, early on, about how to deal with the issues of implementation. So thank you, and thank again, Professor Raver.